Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Kellen Cavanero, and welcome to another episode of Inflammatory Content, the podcast about immunology and biomedical research more broadly. It is normally my job to interview world-class researchers to broadly communicate the cutting-edge work going on in their laboratories and to get to know the people behind the science. But today we're going to do something a little different, a solo episode, but not a journal club. I was recently asked to put together a Ph.D. fellowship application survival guide for first-year graduate students in the UCSD Biomedical Sciences Ph.D. program. In this episode, I will give an overview of this Ph.D. fellowship application survival guide with the goal of helping you secure a fellowship to support your research. So sit back, relax, and let's dive into some grant writing. And if you enjoy the show, please consider sharing the episode, leaving a review, or donating to support our work. Thanks for listening. One of the things that trainees most consistently ask me about is, how do I get a fellowship for my PhD? So today I'd like to go over the who, what, where, when, why, and how of fellowship applications. This is by no means an exhaustive discussion of the topic. My goal here is to introduce fellowships and motivate your further learning and application for these fellowships. I think I'm pretty qualified to speak about this topic. I have been very fortunate to have been awarded several fellowships. For example, in my PhD, I was awarded a UCSD NIH Gastroenterology T32, the NSF GRFP, and the ARCS Scholarship, as well as many travel grants, scholarships, and honoraria. And then in my postdoc, I've now secured funding through the UCSD NIH Caring T32, as well as the Hartwell Foundation Fellowship. And I just submitted my first big NIH grant, the NIH K99R00, for my transition to independence. So I've applied to internal fellowships, external, private, government scholarships, as well as fellowships. And I've been very fortunate to have earned a lot of them. And I do think that I am very lucky, but I also think there are some decisions that you can make that can give yourself the best chance to get these applications to increase your luck. Now, as I mentioned, this is not an exhaustive discussion. There are already so many resources available for applying for fellowships, and I'll put some links to these in the show notes. There are, for example, databases of funding opportunity announcements that catalog all of the different fellowships. There are many how-to guides. Each PhD program probably has their own repository of successful applications that you can go to if you're currently a student somewhere. And then each institution probably has their own resources available for people applying to grants. Now, why would you want a fellowship? For one, it will make your PI very happy, and it will make them happy because the fellowship generally will cover a large portion of your salary, which will leave more money for experiments. Getting a fellowship will improve your CV and help you get future awards and positions, both in and out of academia. I like to think of this as a snowball effect. If you get one fellowship or award, when you apply for the next one, they see that you got that previous one, and they're like, oh, wow, they must be really good. They have this other fellowship. Let's give them another one. So getting awards helps you get more awards. There's a lot of career development opportunities that come with fellowships. You may be invited to networking opportunities or to give talks. Applying for fellowships will give you more writing experience. There's generally a lot of writing involved in these applications, and writing is a very translational skill that can help you both in science and out. Applying for a fellowship will help you gain clarity on your project. If you're applying for an NIH fellowship, this will help you familiarize yourself with the NIH grant process. In some instances, getting a fellowship may mean more money for you. We all know as grad students, it's a very tough situation financially, and anything really helps. In my program, if you got the NSF GRFP or an NIH F31, and I'll talk more about what these are later, you get a couple $1,000 bonus. And lastly, fellowships may provide supplemental funds. So you could potentially go to more conferences and meet more people. or buy a laptop. A quick note on fellowships versus scholarships. I will focus today on fellowships, but also be on the lookout and apply for scholarships. Fellowships, the money goes to the lab, whereas with scholarships, the money goes to you. And I was very fortunate to get this ARCS fellowship, which paid me an extra $10,000 every year for up to 3 years. That was super helpful. All right, different types of fellowships. You can categorize fellowships many different ways. Internal versus external. For example, NIH T32s would be internal, whereas NIH F31 and NSF GRFP would be external. Internal meaning your institute applies for that fund, and then you will apply for a spot on that grant. Versus external, you're applying directly to the government or private institute, for example. The next distinction can be between government versus private fellowships, and private can be companies or foundations, nonprofit or for-profit. And some examples of this would be the NIH F31 would be government versus, for example, the BioLegend fellowship would be a private fellowship. Fellowships can be discipline-specific or more general. So an example of a discipline-specific fellowship would be the gastroenterology T32. So you would really only apply to this if you were doing gastroenterology work. And an example of a general fellowship would be the NSF GRFP. There are many different types of science that can fall under the GRFP's umbrella. And the last distinction that I could come up with was demographic specific versus general. There's a lot of fellowships that are designed for people that belong to specific demographics, for example, groups underrepresented in science. And some fellowships, like the NSF GRFP, are for all comers. Now, there are many, many fellowships. There are a few that are very common. For example, in my PhD program, many of the students had either an NIH T32, an NIH F31, or an NSF GRFP. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about these applications. The NIH T32, as I mentioned, these are grants that your institute will apply for, and then you will apply for a space on that grant. The application to get a spot on that grant is generally pretty simple, something you could perhaps finish in a day. And there is a very high likelihood of success that you will get this space on this grant if there is space available and if your mentor is affiliated with the T32. For this reason, I would say that it is less prestigious than the others, whereas it is more political, whether you get on it or not. The NSF GRFP is also a pretty simple application, but a lot more involved than your run-of-the-mill T32 application. A lot of it is about you and quote-unquote broader impacts, how your work and what you do will more broadly impact society. There is a decent amount about research and the training plan, but relatively small amount. And this is a very competitive and prestigious award. The NIH F31, I would say, is the most complex application of these three. There is a lot about research and training plan in this grant, a little bit about you, and it is also very competitive. I mentioned that I just applied to the NIH K99, and while I was writing my K99, I took a look at some of my peers' NIH grants, and I looked at a few F31s, and I was surprised to find that the application, while it wasn't quite as comprehensive as a K99, there was still a lot of parts involved in this. I was surprised by how much you had to do to apply to this. So you need to give yourself a lot of time to complete an F31. In addition to these three very common fellowships, there are many less common PhD fellowships, but by no means are they less prestigious or should you not apply. For example, there's the HHMI PhD fellowships, there's the BioLegend, as I mentioned before. There's hundreds of these. So I urge you to check out the databases and see whether you are eligible. Now, fewer people apply, and this could suggest that there's a higher likelihood that you will have success. And I know a lot of people that have these, so it is possible to get them. And I say if you are eligible and you do not have another fellowship, I would 100% apply to these. Now, when should you apply to fellowships, at least the common fellowships? For the NSF GRFP, you should apply as soon as possible once you join a PhD program. This would be in your first or second year at the latest. For me, I waited until my second year. In my program, we rotated in labs our first year, and I felt a little strange about writing a grant proposal when I wasn't in a lab yet, because I wanted to propose something that I actually could potentially do. And so I waited until I joined a lab and applied my second year. For the NIH T32, I think you should apply to this as soon as you join a lab. For me, as soon as I joined my thesis lab, my PI told me about a T32 that he was affiliated with and suggested that I apply. So I think your PI will guide you to this if they are involved in a T32. For the NIH F31, because this is a lot more complex of an application, I think you should apply to this once your project is more developed, which is generally in the third year or so. And I'm also going to mention the NIH F99, which is, I'd say, a less common fellowship, but I want to put it on your radar because I did not know about it. This is a transition to postdoc award. So when you're starting to think about doing a postdoc, maybe in your fourth year, look into whether there are F99s available for the kind of work that you do. I know the National Cancer Institute has an F99. So if you're doing cancer work, definitely have this on your radar. And this is a point that I'm going to stress many times today. All fellowships are different. Read the Notice of Funding Opportunity, or NOFO. Follow the directions. And another note is that you can generally only have one fellowship at a time, but most of these cover you for 2 to 3 years. And if you're in a PhD program for around 5-6 years, you could have multiple over the course of your training. Now, I'm assuming most of the people listening are PhD students, maybe PhD students that just started their PhD. And so what can you do now? I think the most important thing you can do is pick a lab with a PI that will support you and your applications. So when you're rotating in labs or when you're interviewing PIs to see who you should work with, these are some important questions to ask. Do current and past students have fellowships? If people have been getting fellowships in this lab, there's an indication that you would have a high chance of getting one too. Will the PI write you letters of rec and nominate you for awards? This is important. You don't want to join a lab with a PI that's not happy to recommend you and nominate you for things. And you're going to be asking them for a lot of letters and nominations throughout your career potentially. So you want someone who's more than willing and happy to do this for you. Will the PI brainstorm specific aims with you? We'll talk more later about what specific aims are, but will the PI help you formulate your proposal? And then finally, will the PI provide feedback on your application? So once you've already written them, will they actually tell you what you need to improve? Okay, what other things can you do now? You can build and update your CV and BioSketch. BioSketch being NIH's format of a CV that they like. So build it and start keeping it up to date. I would suggest to start working on your NSF GRFP and attend any upcoming workshops at your institute on this grant. And then pay attention to your email for notice of funding opportunities. My PhD program, the admin, would send out these all the time. And also I'd suggest to start learning more. Talk to people, your friends, colleagues, read blogs, study example grants, see what works and what doesn't. And then one note, many of you will make an ERA Commons account for your NIH proposals. Just a word of caution that the username that you pick will stick with you for life, so choose that wisely. Okay, now we're going to talk about the bread and butter of a PhD fellowship application. There are 4 main components of these applications: your CV, your personal statement, research statement, and letters of recommendation. However, as I mentioned before, every fellowship is different. Read the notice of funding opportunity and follow the directions very carefully. How will these applications be scored? What should you consider when writing them? First, significance. Will the research significantly advance the field? Does it address a critical gap in knowledge or solve an important problem? 2, innovation. You should focus on showcasing how your research introduces new ideas, techniques, or perspectives. And you should explain how your project will push the boundaries of current knowledge. 3, approach. Is it feasible? Is it achievable within the time frame of the fellowship? This is a very important point. One common thing that I have seen with trainee fellowship applications is that people propose to do too much work. I would suggest erring on the side of less. Propose to do less. Make it rigorous and thorough, but less. You need to be able to prove to the reviewers that you can get this done in the 2 to 3 years of your fellowship. Also, in terms of feasibility, it's important to show some preliminary data. You need to show the reviewers that what you are proposing will succeed. 4, mentor and environment. This is a very important point. What is the mentor's track record of trainee success? It is somewhat unfortunate that the mentor's track record is so important, but it is. If you take 2 applications, all things being equal except for in one application, the mentor is a brand new assistant professor with no track record of trainee success, and the other is a very senior investigator with a very impressive track record of trainee success, the trainee from the very senior mentor's lab will get that award. This is not to say that you should not join a lab with a junior PI. This can be a great decision, but you may want to consider adding a co-mentor on your fellowship application that has a track record of trainee success. The environment, the institute, is also an important point for these applications. Is the institute you are at the ideal place for this work? For example, we have some of the best microbiome researchers at my institute, UCSD. If you are proposing microbiome work in your fellowship application, you will score 10 out of 10 on environment. It is the ideal place for this work. Number 5, training potential. This is also a very important point, probably the most important point. How will the fellowship contribute to your growth? What specific skills, knowledge, and experiences will you gain? Fellowship applications are all about you, the fellow. Yes, you need to include a research proposal. Yes, you need to have letters of recommendation. Yes, you need to have a personal statement. The most important thing of all of this is, how is it going to make you a better scientist? But remember though, every fellowship is different. Read the notice of funding opportunity and follow the directions. Okay, some suggestions for writing your research proposal. Generally, you will apply for these before you have time to generate much preliminary data. For example, you join the lab and then immediately apply for an NSF-GRFP or an NIH-T32. You could try to write a proposal with little to no preliminary data, but this will likely not do well in the feasibility category. Instead, I suggest using your lab's preliminary data with permission from the PI, of course. And even better, use your lab's existing proposals as a jumping off point. Don't propose the exact same aims. You shouldn't do this because there are rules about double dipping, meaning getting funded for the same thing twice. Some suggestions for writing your letters of recommendation. Ask your PI to write the first letter they write for you so that you have an idea of their writing style. Give them your CV, your proposal, tell them what to emphasize, and then edit the letter if necessary and send it back to them. If they don't write you a letter, which is pretty lame, ask them to send you a letter that they wrote for another student and then edit that. And what I do now is whenever I need a new letter from my PI for something, I will use a previous letter as a template, revise it, and then send it to my PI as a draft. And my PI appreciates that because this saves him a lot of time. And importantly, because every fellowship is different, all your letters probably need to be different too. They need to emphasize different points. So again, read those notice of funding opportunities. So once you've started writing your application, you'll want to get feedback on it. I suggest you get feedback from a diverse group of people. Your PI, maybe postdocs and grad students in your lab, committee members, peers. Try to get people inside and outside of your lab because if you keep it all inside, it can be a little bit biased and myopic. And to me, good feedback is not the same as praise for your application. What I would seek is critical appraisal of your application. And to get this sort of critical appraisal, it helps to be specific when you ask for feedback. Specifically ask for what you want someone to look at and what you want them to look for. Suggestions for developing your academic CV. One of the most important things on an academic CV is papers. You need to have papers. In terms of a fellowship application, first author, co-author, original article, review, commentary, peer-reviewed or preprint, whatever, it all helps. You just need to have, frankly, many papers and high-impact journals. Another component of your CV is talks and abstracts. Whenever you submit an abstract for a meeting, I suggest that you always ask to be considered for a talk. There is absolutely no reason to not try to get a talk. You could give a horrible talk and still put it on your CV and it will help you. So always give a talk. And plus, public speaking skills are very important and I would take all the opportunities you can to improve this skill. Other components of an academic CV are the fellowships, scholarships, awards. That's, what we're talking about today. And then a fourth category would be leadership, outreach, teaching. And so some examples from my CV, I was very involved in my graduate program student council. I peer reviewed a lot of papers for my PIs. I was a TA for an undergraduate class. I mentored a handful of students, and I have participated in Science Communication, the podcast. Some miscellaneous tips for you and reflections from my recent experience with the K99. Start early. Give yourself plenty of time. Do a little bit every day, and you will be amazed at how fast you can get this done. And you don't have to stress about these things. They can be stressful, but you don't have to stress. Make sure the application that you submit is polished. Don't submit a sloppy application with tons of typos. Reviewers are going to have a very short period of time to look at your application, and you don't want to give them any reason to hate it. And it's really hard to focus on the content of an application when there are so many distracting, sloppy aspects of it. Make your figures look really nice. They should be high resolution. The text should be large enough to read easily. Use proper naming convention. If you do these things, people will then be able to focus on the actual content of your application. Now, something that is a new development in the fellowship application space is artificial intelligence. And now we have these large language models like ChatGPT, which I am sure PhD students are now using for their applications. I can imagine that students are using these models for outlining, for writing, for getting feedback, for editing. To my knowledge, there are really not that many guidelines available in academia yet for the use of artificial intelligence. I recently looked this up and I saw that the NIH and I believe the NSF have guidelines now for use of these models as a reviewer, saying you can't plug in a grant application that you receive into these models to help you review it. And this is for security reasons, primarily, I believe, because these data are not secure if you're putting them into a model that's on the cloud. But there's really limited guidelines elsewhere. Personally, my feeling is that using an LLM for actual writing is frowned upon. And also, I don't know if it would work very well, but I do see the positives of outlining and for feedback and editing for clarity and grammar, for example. But I would just be on the lookout for guidelines that fellowships are going to release for these AI tools coming soon. And I'm sure this will evolve because these LLMs are evolving rapidly. Finishing up here, one of the final topics I wanted to discuss was handling rejection. So rejection is very normal in science, especially in grant writing. When you all are PIs eventually, most of your grants will be rejected. But we can't take it personally. We need to try to learn from reviewer feedback, improve, reapply. These grants are a crapshoot. There's a lot of luck involved. Who's reading your application? What mood are they in that day? You can do everything right, but you also have to get a little lucky. So if it doesn't work out, keep trying, and you will succeed eventually. In conclusion, apply to many fellowships, scholarships, and other awards. Apply, apply, apply. These awards will help you advance your career, whether you stay in academia or you move on to industry. I've said it many times, but I'm going to say it again. Every fellowship is different. Read the notice of funding opportunity and follow the directions exactly. Lastly, fellowships are awesome, but remember, you are in grad school to do science. Don't lose sight of that because it's the most important thing. You do not need fellowships to advance your career. They will help, but they are not necessary. And they are also not sufficient. You still have to do science. That concludes today's solo episode. I hope you found it helpful. If you did, please consider sharing the episode with your friends and colleagues, writing a review, or donating to support the show. You can find all relevant links in the show notes. And please reach out to me with any questions, comments, or if you would like the PowerPoint version of the PhD Fellowship Application Survival Guide. Good luck with your applications. Adios.